Atlus's 2011 dating sim cum puzzle game Catherine is a cult classic. From the perspective of Vincent, a 30-something-year-old guy who feels stifled by his steady long-term relationship, the player explores themes of infidelity, freedom, marriage, gender, and control. Renan Fontes, writing for The Gamer, says of the game, "One of Atlus's most emotionally mature and thoughtful games, Catherine is a testament to the potential of storytelling in the gaming medium. Its striking visuals and unique game mechanics have secured its place in gaming history as one of the first of its kind." Given the success of the original game, it is no surprise that Atlus chose to release the remaster Catherine Full Body in 2019, improving the gameplay and adding a third romanceable character to the roster, Rin. Promotional images that suggest a mystery surrounding Rin's genitals, as well as worrying reports of Vincent assaulting her from beta testers in Japan, caused widespread anger as fans assumed the worst from Atlus. Believing that Rin was a poorly executed attempt at writing a trans woman character, many LGBTQ+ Western games journalists and fans of Atlus called on players to boycott the release when it became available worldwide. The original release of Catherine already featured a trans woman character, albeit not in a leading role. Erica, a waitress at the Stray Sheep bar, is also a trans woman whose writing has faced criticism from fans in the past. So what, if anything, did Atlus do differently this time? How did they handle the treatment of two trans women in this remixed version of the game? Hi, and welcome back to Game Assist. My name is Daz, and my pronouns are they, them. Before we dive into this essay, be sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons, and turn on notifications to know when we upload next. We'd also really appreciate it if you supported us on Patreon, to help us continue to make content like this. Go to patreon.com/gameassist to pledge your support. This essay contains spoilers for Catherine and Catherine Full Body, specifically in reference to Rin's romantic storyline in Full Body, plus some spoilers for Persona 4 and 5. Some of the viewers of this essay might find the following content disturbing or triggering, so here are some trigger warnings for your discretion. This video essay features discussions and depictions of transphobia and transmisogyny, and discussions of the fetishization of transfeminine people, the derogatory term trap, sexual assault and rape, and vomit. The language around trans identities, experiences, and politics can be daunting to those who haven't encountered them before. So before we continue, here are some definitions that you might find useful. LGBTQ+ charity Stonewall defines transgender as an umbrella term to describe people whose gender is not the same as, or does not sit comfortably with, the sex they were assigned at birth. Assigned sex or gender at birth refers to the gender marker that is put on your birth certificate based on the outward appearance of your primary sex organs as a newborn. Even though there is a wide variety of human genitalia, birth sex is medically categorized into a binary system of male and female, based on whether the genitalia resembles a penis or a vagina. Transgender identity includes binary trans people, who are those trans people whose identity remains within the gender binary of male and female, and non-binary people, whose gender is not the same as their assigned birth gender, but also isn't 100% male or female all of the time. As non-binary is an umbrella term for anyone whose gender falls outside the binary, there is a vast amount of variation across the globe, from internationally recognized terms like genderqueer and bigender, to culturally specific identities like Two-Spirit Native Americans, who are said to have both a male and female spirit within them, and the Mahu from Hawaii. I am a non-binary trans person. I identify as a demigirl, meaning my gender is partially female and partially something else. As I was assigned a different gender when I was born, this makes me transgender. In this essay, we'll be discussing transfemininity, which is defined by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary as of, relating to, or being a person whose gender identity is partially or fully feminine and differs from the sex the person had or was identified as having at birth. They also quote Sean Ferguson, who said, "Transfeminine people are people who were assigned male at birth, AMAB, but identify more with a feminine identity." The terms transfemininity and transfeminine can be useful in order to describe the shared experiences of trans women and feminine-aligned AMAB non-binary people. Transfeminine cannot be used to describe people who were assigned female at birth, even if their gender identity is linked to womanhood. Think of it as someone transitioning towards femininity. When discussing transgender issues, comparisons of biological sex, gender identity, and gender expression are commonplace. Biological sex refers to the sex marker you were given at birth based on your primary sex characteristics. Gender identity is defined by Stonewall as a person's innate sense of their own gender, whether male, female, or something else, which may or may not correspond to their sex assigned at birth. Gender expression is all about how people show their gender to the world through clothing, behaviours, etc. None of these three have to correlate to each other. For example, I was assigned female at birth based on my anatomy. My gender identity is barely female, and I tend to present myself in ways that society would deem hyperfeminine, such as wearing lots of makeup and dressing in Lolita fashion. People often refer to transgender identity using the born in the wrong body metaphor. Whilst this may be accurate for some people, it is typically an overgeneralization that has come from the pathologization of sex and gender. Not everyone has an innate sense of their gender, as the Stonewall definition used earlier puts it, nor should they be expected to. Agender people, for example, feel that they have no gender. Gender may be informed by your relationship to your body, but it is also influenced by many other factors in society. Gender is a social construct that was created to separate humans into a single dominant and single oppressed gender under the patriarchy. Judith Butler famously describes gender as a performative act. These roles were mapped onto human bodies based on differences in primary and secondary sex characteristics, with the latter referring to things like vocal pitch, body hair distribution, and the presence or absence of breast tissue. This is important to note as it can help people to understand why not all trans people want to undergo medical interventions as part of their transitions. You can be transgender without changing anything about your body, as gender is about more than the physical. Due to the overwhelming presence of cis-heteropatriarchal capitalistic governments around the globe, transphobia is commonplace. Transmisogynistic violence in particular has been seeing a huge rise over the past couple of years in the UK and the US. The Cambridge Dictionary defines transmisogyny as dislike or unfair treatment of transgender women. Transmisogyny is at the intersection of misogyny and transphobia, a unique form of oppression faced by transfeminine people. Cis-heteropatriarchal systems position men as dominant within society, and value cisgender, heterosexual nuclear families for the role they play in continuing to uphold this fabricated belief. As women are the oppressed group, being female or even just feminine is seen as weak and undesirable. Thanks to biological essentialism, transphobes also see trans women as predatory men who are masquerading as women to access single-sex spaces. Women's anger at the patriarchy for allowing gender-based violence to become so widespread becomes incorrectly attributed to transfeminine people. The patriarchy uses them as a scapegoat. Transmisogyny can have particularly violent and deadly consequences, as seen by the high numbers of trans women who are murdered each year. A term that does not directly refer to trans feminine people, but is rooted in the straight cis male fear of being attracted to a trans woman, is trap. This term is typically used to refer to cisgender male anime characters who dress in feminine clothing, and who are mistaken for being cisgender women. According to the Urban Dictionary, the term comes from an anime trope of a character dressing up in drag to trick people into thinking that they're the opposite gender. Although these characters do not identify as transfeminine, the portrayal of them and the men that are trapped by them leads to harmful misogynistic actions in the real world. People begin to believe that trans women are out to deceive straight cis men into turning gay by being attracted to them, despite the fact they are women. It is not gay for a man to be attracted to a woman. Our final definition is cissexism. This refers to the manifestation of normalized structural transphobia through words and actions that uphold the cisgender binary as the norm. According to Healthline, cissexism operates as a subtle web of ideas that many people hold based on the assumption that all people are cisgender. Because this assumption is so deeply ingrained in our society, many people say and do things that are cissexist without realizing it. Some examples could be referring to all people who give birth as women, or saying that all women have a menstrual cycle at some point in their lives. These assumptions are both based on the cisgender binary construction of what makes a woman a woman. As the plot of Catherine Full Body will show, when you assume, you make an ass of you and me. As we've said many times before, games do not exist within a vacuum. This means it's important for us to explore the wider contextual setting of the games we discuss, so that we can further understand and analyse their content. For this essay on transfemininity in a Japanese role-playing game, or JRPG, we need to understand the current state of trans legal rights and social acceptance in Japan, as well as the history of trans feminine representation in visual media like TV, film, and other video games. I touched briefly on Japan's legal provision for transgender people in my video on Nintendo and the LGBTQ+ community, but for this essay I've gone into a little more depth. Thanks to Laurel Hubbard's appearance at the rescheduled Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games, and a 2021 report by Human Rights Watch, there has been plenty of media coverage on trans rights in Japan in recent months. Although it is not illegal to be LGBTQ+ in Japan, same-sex marriages are not recognised by the national government, and same-sex couples are unable to adopt children or access fertility treatment. Using legality as a way to measure living conditions and societal attitudes towards certain groups is a flawed system, as it equates legality with liberation. Western countries such as the USA and the UK may be upheld as better places to be queer due to gay marriage legislation and civil rights protections, but violent and systemic queerphobia still persists. As a white British person, I am in no place to say whether Japan is a better or worse place to be LGBTQ+, but I can provide objective contextual information based on laws. With this in mind, while same-sex marriage is still not legal on a national level in Japan, there are legal procedures in place for citizens to change their gender marker on the family register and other identification documents. The Gender Identity Disorder Special Cases Act, which came into effect in 2004, is Japan's first and only law regarding gender reassignment. It is summarised by Human Rights Watch as contrary to international human rights law and international medical best practices, and guilty of violating fundamental human rights. The GID Act sets out a list of requirements that a transgender person must fulfill in order to change their gender marker on the National Family Register and to be legally recognised as their correct gender. It is not unusual for governments to request some form of assessment before granting changes to legal markers. In the UK, for example, we have the Gender Recognition Certificate, which requires trans people to have lived as their current gender for more than 2 years and that they have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. The majority of trans people around the world would prefer that these systems operated on a system of self-identification, believing trans people when they tell you that they are trans and want to transition. What sets the GID Act apart from other international gender assessments is that it requires trans people to make much larger, irreversible, life-changing decisions before being granted a legal gender change. These include not having underage children, where the age of adulthood in Japan is 20, being presently unmarried, being over the age of 20, undergoing medical sterilization, and having a physical form that is endowed with genitalia that closely resemble the physical form of an alternative gender, aka you must have undergone bottom surgery. In order to gain legal recognition in Japan, trans people frequently have to choose between progressing their transition and having biological children, or getting married. Many trans people around the world choose not to undergo bottom surgery for a variety of reasons, but the requirement of genital alterations to change your gender marker has meant that trans people in Japan feel more pressure to go under the knife. The requirement that a transgender person not have underage children if they wish to secure legal recognition of their gender identity violates transgender people's right to privacy and family life. Mandatory surgical interventions amount to coercion, and legal gender recognition is an essential element of other fundamental rights, including the right to privacy, the right to freedom of expression, and rights related to employment, education, health, and the ability to move freely. Japanese law also continues to view transgenderism as a mental illness, as shown by the name of the Gender Identity Disorder Special Cases Act. In the World Health Organization's most recent international classification of diseases, transsexualism and gender identity disorder were removed as mental disorders, in line with the changes made by the American Psychological Association in 2012. Recently, Japanese public opinion has also begun to disagree with the GID Act as it stands, calling for easier access to legal gender recognition and the declassification of transgender identity as a mental illness. On a Japanese family TV show in 2019, a trans woman was outed without her consent and mocked by the host, who called her unusual. According to Human Rights Watch, after a public outcry erupted on social media, the company apologized for the humiliating incident. As of 2016, around half of people in Japan believe that trans people should be allowed to change their legal gender, give birth, and not be classified as mentally ill. Only 13% thought surgery should be required to change legal gender. Despite the changing public attitudes towards trans people in Japan, strict legal restrictions and harmful media portrayals continue to make the lives of trans people in Japan difficult. As shown in the previous example of Japanese TV, trans women and trans feminine people are rarely shown in sympathetic or three-dimensional lights in visual media. There are plenty of sources out there arguing this point, but Netflix's 2020 documentary Disclosure neatly summarizes the history of transphobia and particularly transmisogyny in the film and television industries. Whilst Disclosure is a useful resource, it focuses primarily on Western media history. Some of the points raised may be applicable to Japanese media, but they won't map perfectly. As a white British person, I am also not qualified to comment on the specific context of Japanese media portrayals of trans women, nor do I have the means to access the media products in question. I will be making reference to 2 Japanese media sources throughout this section, comparing them to similar Western sources covered in Disclosure. These are the subversive comedy anime Backstreet Girls Goku Dolls and Hibana Spark, Netflix's adaptation of a novel by the same name. The representation of trans women in the media has a direct impact on the way that they are treated by society, and on the way trans feminine people view themselves when they are figuring out their identities. Actor and executive producer Laverne Cox mentions early on in Disclosure that even trans-coded characters affected the way she viewed herself and the way other people viewed her. This will become important when we talk about a certain character in Catherine Full Body later. In the history of visual media, trans feminine characters have been included to fulfill a certain role in the narrative. More often than not, this is either for the purpose of tragedy or comedy. Disclosure discusses the strange fascination that Hollywood, and particular Alfred Hitchcock, had with murderous men in dresses serving as their main antagonists. Psycho and Silence of the Lambs are just 2 films which provide examples of this trope. Nick Adams, GLAAD's director of transgender representation, said that these films make people think that we're dangerous, that we're psychopaths, that we're serial killers, that we must be deviants or perverts. Why else would you wear a dress if you're a man? And when trans feminine people aren't portrayed as the killer, they are often portrayed as the victim. Candice Kane, who is most well known for her role as Carmelita on Dirty Sexy Money, spoke about this in Disclosure.
They've died so many times they can't even count on camera.
Trans women have appeared in TV shows countless times as one-off characters just to die on screen. The most typical instances of this are trans women sex workers who are violently murdered, and trans women in hospital dramas who are dying of something related to their birth sex. Alexandra Gray appeared on both Code Black and Chicago Med in 2016, playing trans women who were dying of testicular or prostate cancer. These storylines constantly affirm to the audience, among whom there are undoubtedly trans feminine people beginning to explore their gender identity, that trans women do not get a future. That trans women will be killed in an act of violence, or die tragically from medical conditions. There's even a trend of trans representation in films where cis people get cast to portray trans suffering, and then receive awards for it. As Jen Richards said, "The public thinks of trans women as men with really good hair and makeup in costume. Having cis men play trans women, in my mind, is a direct link to the violence against trans women. If trans women aren't in a film to die or be the killer, then they must be there for comedy. That's what Hollywood seems to think anyway." In 1992, The Crying Game was released, featuring a romantic plotline between a cis man and a trans woman. The film features a scene where the 2 characters are about to have sex, and the man sees the woman's genitalia for the first time. When he sees a penis instead of a vagina, he is disgusted and runs to the bathroom to vomit. In the same way that Psycho created this ripple effect of cross-dressing psychopathic serial killers, The Crying Game created a ripple effect of men reacting with vomiting when they see a transgender woman. This scene in The Crying Game is far from funny, but it generated the trope of men vomiting in disgust at trans women, which was often played for laughs. Similar scenes appear in Naked Gun 33 1/3, The Final Insult, Family Guy, The Hangover Part 2, and Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. This particular scene even makes direct reference to The Crying Game, playing the film's titular song over Jim Carrey heaving into a toilet and scrubbing his mouth out. Turning to our Japanese media examples, in the final episode of Hibana Spark, comedian Kamiya gets breast enhancement surgery in the hopes that the sight of a man with breasts will make his jokes seem even funnier. This scene portrays Kamiya as desperate, and protagonist Tokunaga disagrees with his decision. but the link between men with breasts and comedy in the plot still reveals a lot about the use of transmisogyny for comedic effect in Japanese entertainment. The vomiting reaction is also frequently paired with the cis character claiming that they have been tricked or betrayed by the trans person, centering the feelings of the cis person in this interaction. This is Western media's equivalent to the trap anime trope, framed through a slightly less comedic lens. 2018's anime Backstreet Girls' Goku Dolls relies almost exclusively on the trap trope for its comedy. The plot revolves around 3 Yakuza men who, as punishment for failing an assignment, must undergo gender reassignment surgeries and become idols in Akihabara. Scenes of male fans harassing them and sexualizing them are paired with dramatic close-ups of the characters' male faces, emphasizing that, in the words of Caitlin Moore for the Daily Dot, since they're men, it's actually gay. Backstreet Girls' Goku Dolls plays into the increasingly popular fear that gender transition is foisted on people who really may just be gender non-conforming, or the transphobic belief that trans women are actually men in disguise trying to trap unsuspecting straight men. A third function of the transfeminine character in film is to facilitate the growth of a straight cis man. We discussed a directly correlated trope in video games at length in our Bisexuality as a Game Mechanic essay, where women feature in games purely to serve as a plot device in a man's story. This can be seen, for example, in Dallas Buyers Club. The film is based on true events, but Jared Leto's character Rayon never existed in the original story. She serves to open the mind of the main character and help him recover from drug addiction. Once she has fulfilled her role, Rayon's own addiction relapses and she ends up dying. This is a particularly harmful exploitation of trans tragedy to further the plot of a cis person. Turning now to video games, although the explicit representation of trans feminine people in video games is few and far between, the instances where it does occur tend to also draw from these tropes. D. King made a list of trans characters in video games through the years, and found that many of them fell into the categories of trans women or drag queen ambiguity, sex workers, and/or victims of uncomfortable genital reveals once they had died, for example in the case of Chihiro Fujisaki in Danganronpa Trigger Happy Havoc. Dragon Age 2 included multiple trans characters, but the only trans feminine characters are sex worker characters, whose gender identities are played for jokes. As D. King states, there's nothing wrong with depicting trans characters as sex workers in games, but there is, however, an inherent problem in depicting trans and gender non-conforming people only as sexual objects. The vast majority of canonical and sensitive trans representation in games currently can be found in the indie game scene, often with trans people playing major roles on the development team. Games like Celeste, Do I Pass, and Monster Prom all feature trans feminine characters, with stories that range from those that are unrelated to gender identity, simply normalizing the existence of trans people, to those entirely focused on the topic, providing in-depth and nuanced explorations from a place of lived experience. With all of this in mind, it's easy to see why fans were apprehensive about Catherine Full Body after seeing promotional images for Rin. Trans representation in video games, just like the medium in general, has a much shorter history than representation in TV and film, and it appears to be falling into the same potholes as these older visual mediums. The interactivity of video games brings an interesting new element to representation in media, which arguably has more power to influence the actions of the players than more passive visual mediums have over viewers. So, will Catherine Full Body be the AAA game to give us a sensitive, three-dimensional portrayal of a trans feminine person? It's important to note before exploring the transmisogyny present in Catherine Full Body that the developer Atlus has a checkered past with the LGBTQ+ community. Catherine and Catherine Full Body are both standalone titles, but Atlus is also globally known for its franchises, namely Shin Megami Tensei and Persona, which itself was a spin-off of SMT. According to Transgirl Media in an article about Catherine Full Body, it's natural to be apprehensive about the new Catherine game regarding Atlus's previous treatment of LGBT characters. Persona 2, 3, 4 all feature scenes that are heavily homophobic and transphobic. Laura Kate Dale points out in her review of Persona 5 Royal that a scene featuring 2 gay male NPCs still presents them as predatory and the butt of the joke, despite being changed for the 2019 remaster. The punchline is now, isn't it funny that these gay men made a boy wear women's clothes despite the fact that they were clearly making him uncomfortable? instead of the previous joke that was based on the punchline of "Isn't the implied threat of sexual assault or even rape hilarious?" This isn't just an issue with background characters. Persona 4's Kanji Tatsumi becomes the root of gay panic dialogue after realizing and accepting his bisexual identity, robbing his coming out of any real substance. In the same game, Naoto Shirogane, who is clearly coded as a transmasculine person, faces misgendering and peer pressure from the player character to present in a more feminine way. According to Carol Grant for Vice in 2017, during an intimate moment between you and Naoto where he expresses his wish to have been born a boy, you are able to initiate romance with him by responding, "I'm glad you're a girl." Later, after confessing your love, you're able to ask him to change his talk in a higher pitch to sound more feminine. If you do so, Naoto comes to school in a girl's uniform during the Christmas event. The Persona games are well loved by much of the LGBTQ+ gaming community, despite Atlus's repeated tactless and disrespectful treatment of us. I wish to stress the global success of Atlus's titles, including Catherine, as many will shrug off the queerphobic content as a cultural difference. Not only is this disrespectful to the queer people in Japan who want to see themselves in video games and other media, but it blatantly ignores the part played by Western audiences in the success of these series. If anything, Atlus knows that queerphobia is just as normalized in Western societies, so it can get away with these jokes and still succeed in the global market. Now that we're deep enough into the essay, I can finally reveal the main spoiler for Catherine Full Body that is integral to my arguments. In official canon, Rin is not a trans woman, he is a cis man. That being said, this essay is still fundamentally about transfemininity, as Rin still represents a cultural view of trans women as simply men in dresses, and many of his plot points are rooted in transmisogyny and gay panic. Rin's male identity does not detract from the way he is treated as a feminine person who was assigned male at birth, and the game certainly leads us to believe that he is a woman for a good portion of the plot. In Bye Bye Birdo, Heroic Androgyny and Villainous Gender Variance in Video Games, a chapter from Queerness in Play, Megan Blythe Adams describes how androgyny and gender variance are represented differently in video games, particularly from a Japanese context. They discuss how gender-fluid villains are often portrayed as traps looking to coerce straight men into having sex with them. These depictions often simultaneously trade on stereotypes about transgender women and gay men. The gender-fluid villain is often thought to be attempting to masquerade as a woman, as well as being a sexually voracious predator out to trick men into sex. As Adams states here, the gender identity of the character does not matter, as both effeminate gay men and transgender women are villainized through their connection to feminine presentation. The associations of Rin with transfemininity continue, as one of the first trailers shows Vincent surprised while looking at Rin unclothed, and his colour scheme matches with the pastel pink, blue, and white of the trans flag. Even if this was unintentional, players are likely to make some kind of connection between the treatment of Rin in Catherine Full Body and their interactions with trans women in real life. As Transgirl Media points out, I also do not think that Rin's identity officially being labelled as male necessarily devalues critiques regarding those who find transphobic aspects in his portrayal. Vincent's exaggerated and dramatised reaction to Rin's anatomy is truly the focal point of the trans panic narrative surrounding Catherine Full Body. Vincent is specifically shocked and disgusted at the sight of someone he perceived to be a girl having a penis. The scene harkens back to similar reveals that we discussed earlier in The Crying Game and Ace Ventura Pet Detective, signalling to the player two main points. Women should not have penises, and Rin is in the wrong for misleading or trapping Vincent by presenting so femininely. But here's where it gets interesting. The case for Rin can definitively be classed as trans panic rather than gay panic, as Vincent can still continue to pursue him romantically. Once confirming that Rin is in fact male, although this confirmation is questionable in itself as we'll discuss later, Vincent once again becomes comfortable with seeing himself with Rin in the future. The player can achieve a happy ending with Rin where Vincent is his manager and also his boyfriend. Vincent appears to be more open with his sexuality and embraces his romantic feelings for Rin as a man. This leads us to believe that Vincent's initial shock and disgust was not at the idea of being romantically attracted to a person with a penis, but specifically to a woman with a penis. Rin as a feminine man is fine by him, but a trans woman with a penis? Unacceptable. As alluded to before, There's something to be said for the difference between androgyny and gender variance, or nonconformity, and how those variations on traditional gender roles are portrayed in video games. Many sources discussing Rin describe him as androgynous, but this is not the case. He can be more accurately described as gender nonconforming or gender variant. The difference, according to Adams, is, more specifically, androgynous heroes exhibit relatively few secondary sex characteristics, such as facial hair or a large waist-to-hip ratio, while gender variant characters exhibit a mix of secondary sex characteristics and social signifiers of gender, including clothing and cosmetics. Adams explains that androgyny is often attributed to hero characters and follows a white, slim, able-bodied and masculine view of what is seen as neutral and default. Androgyny is still a form of gender variance for AFAB people, but it is specifically viewed in a more positive light than other forms of gender variance and nonconformity due to its links to masculinity. Gender variance, on the other hand, tends to mix signifiers of masculinity and femininity together, and frequently the characters are portrayed as vain men wearing dresses and makeup. Given this distinction, Rin is much closer to the example of gender variant than androgynous. This same logic is used in the real world to enact violence on transfeminine people, as presenting femininely in a masculine-coded body is seen as aesthetically displeasing and unacceptable. Society's patriarchal understanding of masculine equaling good and feminine equaling bad has led to a trend within video games of transfeminine coded characters being viewed as variously humorous, pitiable, or monstrous, and often all three. Vincent's over-the-top reaction to Rin's genitals is definitely played for laughs, as many other genital reveals have been framed in TV and film history. Even though Rin is not a villain, this coding throughout video games could certainly lead the player to view him as humorous, pitiable, and monstrous. As Adams explains, in mainstream video games, androgyny has frequently been used to reify a very specific type of largely white, thin, and able-bodied masculinity in games, and gender variance has been used to vilify trans women and femininity more broadly. Rin's male identity does not detract from the effect of his feminine presentation on the treatment of trans women in media and in the real world. The othering and literal alienation of Rin is taken one step further once the player discovers that he is in fact a non-human life form. This links to the monstrous portrayal of gender variant people, as his hyperfemininity is directly linked to his alien origin. Alien not only means extraterrestrial, but strange, foreign, and something to be feared. This reinforces the idea that transfeminine people are not normal, and don't deserve the same rights as other people in society. A natural part of human society is annexed to the realm of science fiction, which can lead to deadly consequences for trans women in the real world. It's not uncommon for gender non-conforming people to be represented by aliens in media. There's a whole TV trope dedicated to the non-human, non-binary character. This refers to any non-human character or group of characters that do not identify as exclusively male or female. They may identify as both or neither of these, or as different genders at different times. They may be aliens who have a completely different, if any, concept of gender as we understand it, or they may be totally absent of biological sex or natural gender tendency, such as robots. This trope appears frequently in Western media, from Double Trouble, the shape-shifting green alien in She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, to Janet, the female-presenting but not actually female, as she frequently tells us, anthropomorphized vessel of knowledge from The Good Place. Most recently, non-binary non-human discourse has resurfaced thanks to the recent canonizing of Loki's gender fluidity in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But why is this relevant? Rin isn't non-binary, he's a boy. Or is he? Myself and many others online are unsatisfied with the canon decision to make Rin a boy, as he is so clearly coded as non-binary. Transgirl Media said that the insistence that Rin is male seemed somewhat strange to me, considering how when we see the members of his alien race they appear to be genderless. And Jade King points out the problematic way that the game tries to pass Rin off as a male crossdresser, despite their character being transcoded in so many obvious ways. Adams points out in Queerness in Play that it would be disingenuous to describe gender-variant characters as genderqueer, or their practices as a kind of genderfuck. Many of these are written from a perspective that does not acknowledge or respect the legitimacy of identities outside the cisgender binary identity. Once we discover that Rin is not a girl after his genital reveal, the only other option is that he must be a boy. Something that I noted when playing Catherine Full Body is that no one gives Rin the chance to describe his own gender identity. Based on his appearance, voice, and mannerisms, he is assumed to be a girl. Then, upon seeing Rin's genitals, Vincent directly asks if Rin is a guy. He doesn't ask how Rin identifies, but instead presents the option of being male instead of female. Rin responds, "Oh, yeah, that's right," appearing to agree with Vincent, but not outwardly stating that he is male. The one instance of Rin calling himself a boy doesn't come until far later in the story, after Vincent has asserted to him that he must be a guy. We've established that the writers of this game do not acknowledge genders outside of the binary, and this is apparent in how they write Rin. If he isn't a girl, he must be a boy. He isn't allowed to be non-binary. Finally, remember earlier when I mentioned how transfeminine characters are often invented to act as catalysts for the growth of straight white men? Rin never appeared in the original Catherine. He was created specifically for full body, which must mean that he was created with a purpose. The main message of his romantic plot with Vincent revolves around Vincent opening his mind to the possibility of queer love and becoming a more comfortable and accepting person in the process. Rin only matters to the plot due to his connection to Vincent. He is a side character in the Vincent Brooks show. Catherine Fullbody's inclusion of Rin as a neuromanceable character serves two purposes: to create shocking and humorous moments from the trap narrative and exaggerated genital reveal, and to directly facilitate the growth of the straight cis protagonist. Rin himself may not be trans as far as Atlus is concerned, but his treatment in the story still sends harmful messages to players about trans feminine people. It contributes to the othering of gender non-conforming people in our society, and paints trans women as laughable, disgusting, and fundamentally wrong. So if this is how Rin is treated as a feminine cis man, how does Erica, a canon trans woman in Catherine and Catherine Fullbody, fare? As we touched on earlier, there aren't many trans women in video games full stop, let alone ones with nuanced and sympathetic stories in AAA games. Erica Anderson is far from perfect, but as trans feminine representation in video games goes, she's not that bad. Erica is neither the victim nor the killer in Catherine Fullbody. There are some jokes at her expense, but her purpose within the game is more than just comic relief. Erica serves as the rumour mill for the Stray Sheep pub, providing the player with more information about the mysterious weakening deaths befalling young men in the area. She is an older sister figure for Rin, a friend to Orlando, Vincent and Johnny, and a love interest to Toby. The Catherine fan wiki describes her as a likeable, kind and caring individual who happens to be transgender, and also notes that her inclusion as a happy and healthy trans woman in her 30s is significant in a media climate that repeatedly tells us that trans women die young. Critics of Fullbody were very quick to dismiss Erica's character as good representation, presumably due to the continued inclusion of transmisogynistic jokes at her expense. However, Bella Blondeau, a trans woman herself, said that this reaction was reductive and knee-jerk, based in blind anger and a seemingly deliberate misconstruing of the game's intent, messaging, and morality. This point is particularly important, as in both Catherine and Fullbody, we are not supposed to like Vincent or agree with his actions. The player is given no choice over whether Vincent cheats on Catherine or not, which cements this as a part of his character. Him and his friends are flawed people, as are many of the men who visit the Stray Sheep and appear in Vincent's nightmares. While it might be seen as clumsy writing, having Vincent say the things that he does about Erica shows us what kind of a person he is. Blondeau also touches on the importance of Erica's role in the story, or more specifically how she doesn't fill the common tragic trans woman trope. Erica is a character who very much isn't defined by any kind of trauma, other than her breakup. Players aren't privy to harassment she faces in her day-to-day life, nor do they see any form of intense suffering or bodily harm inflicted upon her. Plenty of other visual media sources have shown us on screen the violence and abuse that trans women face, from verbal harassment to murder. We never see Erica experience any of this, related to her gender identity or otherwise. As far as we are aware, Erica is living a happy and fulfilling life, facing the same daily struggles and mundanity as her peers. Having said this, it is still worth critiquing the casual transphobia directed at Erica both within the events of the game and in external media. Like I said, she isn't a horrific example of trans feminine representation, but there are still many things that Atlus got wrong. Erica has been friends with Vincent, Johnny, Orlando, and Catherine McBride since high school, which the game uses as an excuse for various acts of transphobia towards her. Firstly, there's the jokes and comments made by the group of men. Vincent makes several comments that delegitimize her gender that appear to be unprovoked. He tacks man onto the end of statements directed at her, and insinuates that she is not a real woman when she is giving him advice about what women want.
Too, but not Johnny.
Not true. He said he told his girlfriend that he has no intention of marrying her. How can a man tell a woman that? It's like saying, I don't love you. If that happened to me, I'd disappear all over again. So you guys really need to learn how a girl's heart works. A girl is always hoping someone will come and sweep them away.
Oh, come on.
Ahem, sounds like somebody wants to pay their tab right now.
Johnny and Orlando both act uncomfortable when Toby talks about wanting to date Erica, suggesting that they know something he doesn't. These comments tend to go unchallenged by Erica as well, who instead laughs them off or acts as though she does not understand. As Natalie de Graffenried for Kotaku said, "For a game that's about conflicting opinions and learning and growing, the transmisogynistic comments are given a lot of breathing room and seem to be played for laughs at trans women's expense." The most explicit use of this past friendship to unnecessarily comment on Erica's transition is in Catherine with a C's ending, where she rewrites history to make herself and Vincent high school sweethearts. In this alternate flashback, Erica is pre-transition. Her dialogue indicates that she still intends to transition, but there is no reason given for why we are shown her presenting as male. It seems like nothing more than an excuse for Atlus to present Erica as someone who used to be a man for comic or shock value. Even taking Japan's GID Act into account, there are no laws that state an underage person cannot socially transition before they are 20, just that they cannot change their gender marker. A key issue that highlights Atlus's fixation on Erica's assigned gender at birth is that partway through the story, she begins to experience the sheep nightmares. It is made explicitly clear throughout the game that these nightmares have only been affecting men, which tells you all you need to know about how this game views trans women. Some have tried to claim that Erica would still be affected by the curse if it was based on chromosomes rather than gender, but this argument doesn't hold up when you consider that most people don't actually know their chromosomes without getting a test. Plus, this argument also relies on the existence of a binary chromosomal system, which is also not reality. Some intersex people exhibit intersex characteristics because they have differences in their chromosomes. Not all people can be classified as XX or XY. Atlus continues to invalidate Erica's womanhood in aspects outside the game's plot. She is dead named for no reason in the game's credits, manual, and Venus Mode artbook, which also callously claims her body type has surprisingly broad shoulders, and says her sex is male, danse, instead of female, jose, according to the Catherine Wiki. This cannot be read as anything other than intentional transphobia. Atlus wants players to know that Erica is transgender, not to claim representation credit, but specifically to remind people that she used to be a man, hoping to get players to view her as lesser than other women in the game. One of the transmisogynistic comments that Vincent makes about Erica is in relation to trans women competing in sports. This topic has been highly debated over the years, and recently returned to public consciousness as Kiwi weightlifter Laurel Hubbard became the first openly trans woman to compete in the Olympics in Tokyo this summer. According to the New York Times, athletes, advocates for women's sports, and fair sport campaigners have questioned whether Hubbard, who competed in men's competitions before quitting the sport more than a decade ago, has an unfair advantage. Others believe the game's binary categories fail to account for a diverse group of athletes. The argument against trans women in particular competing in women's sports tends to operate on the false assumption that the least skilled transgender athlete is automatically more skilled than the highest ranked cisgender athlete. It claims that transfeminine athletes would always beat cis athletes due to biological advantage. However, this is not the case. As previously stated, Hubbard is the first openly trans woman to even compete in an Olympic Games in any sport. Joanna Harper, who studies transgender athletes at Loughborough University in England, said that transgender women may be bigger or faster than other women, but rarely are those advantages overwhelming. If they were, she said, women like Hubbard would be breaking world records and winning championships, which is not the case. In a conversation at the Stray Sheep, Erica mentions that she is thinking about joining a women's wrestling team. Vincent immediately tells her that this would be impossible, and that he doesn't think they would let her join.
Powerful women are so cool. I wonder if I could get in.
That's impossible.
Oh, I think I'm pretty strong.
The implied reasoning behind this is because she is trans. This is once again another case of Vincent delegitimizing Erica's gender and implying that she is actually a man. However, in one of the game's possible endings, we find out that Erica actually goes on to become a professional wrestler. It's a small but appreciated example of trans joy that we so rarely see in games. Finally, we come to Erica's romantic and sexual relationship with Toby, a straight cis man who does not know that she is trans. Based on what we already know about the treatment of trans women in sexual contexts in the media, and the frequent comments made by Vincent and his friends, you can probably see where this is going. After asking her out several times, Toby begins a sexual relationship with Erica on day 6 of Catherine Full Body, despite Johnny and Orlando's warnings. They are visibly uncomfortable and evasive when he professes his love for her, and even more so when he tells them that he lost his virginity to her. This mirrors Vincent's horror at Ren's genitals, and the vomiting trope in TV and film that was started by the Crying Game. Toby describes his experience with Erica as weird, which the player assumes is because Erica has a penis. This is never confirmed, but the framing of the moment clearly implies this. Though given Erica's age and the requirements of the GID Act, she could have undergone bottom surgery and still received this comment. Or at least that's how the media likes to spin it. According to Dr. Natalia P. Zighareva, not all vaginoplasties produce natural lubrication, and regardless, all vaginoplasties result in lubrication which is different to that of an AFAB person's vagina. Plus, as mentioned in Disclosure, Ava Moore was outed as a trans woman in Nip Tuck when plastic surgeon Christian Troy realizes that her vaginal canal is shorter than that of a cis woman's vagina. If it sounds like a ridiculous way of outing a trans woman just for shock value on a TV show, that's because it is. There is natural variation in all vaginas, as there is variation in all things. Vaginoplasties may be shorter due to not leading to further reproductive organs, but there's no way that this is a reliable way to clock a trans woman. The media just seems intent on telling trans feminine people that their body will never be as good as a cis woman's body. In Catherine with a K's true ending, Toby says that he wants his V card back from Erica and regrets sleeping with her in the first place. This is directly linked to him finding out Erica's dead name. As trans girl media puts it, the two still seem to be on friendly, possibly still romantic terms, but the game portrays the extremely damaging stereotype that trans women are out to trick men into sleeping with them regardless. Once again, the overlap of society's opinions on cross-dressing men and trans women rears its head, painting trans women as deceptive and malicious people who want to turn men gay. The reality is that trans women have a notoriously hard time finding partners no matter their sexual orientation, because of these pervasive and harmful assumptions about them that are spread through the media. We don't know Erica's sexuality, but we at least know that she likes men. Straight cis men are one of the worst groups for both excluding trans women and fetishizing them. A 2018 study from Karen L. Blair and Ray Ashley Hoskin has provided us with numerical data to back up the anecdotal evidence from trans people about how hard it is to date as a trans person. Their study's headline finding was that across a sample of heterosexual, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, and trans individuals, 87.5% indicated that they would not consider dating a trans person, with cisgender heterosexual men and women being most likely to exclude trans persons from their potential dating pool. This data examined the hypothetical dating pools of cis and trans people of a variety of gender and sexual identities, and uncovered the struggles faced by trans people, particularly trans women, when it comes to finding a partner. They write that there is evidence that concerns about dating, finding a partner, and coming out as trans to a new partner are all common stressors for transgender and gender diverse individuals, and that the heightened level of risk faced by trans women dating cisgender heterosexual men may contribute to trans women being less likely to benefit from romantic relationships. Transmisogyny was present across all categories, as based on predicted outcomes, for example a straight man being willing to date both cis and trans women, 19.2% fewer participants than expected were willing to date trans women. When directly compared to the exclusion of trans men, among the queer or bisexual men, women, and non-binary individuals whose self-stated sexual and gender identities would suggest an openness to dating both trans men and trans women, 85% had responses that excluded trans women from their pool of potential dating partners, while only 15% provided answers that excluded trans men as potential dating partners. When it comes to cis men in particular, the main concerns around dating trans women came from being perceived as gay by their peers, or simply being associated with a trans woman. Once again, it is not gay for men to date women, and this study truly highlights the difficulty faced by trans women looking for a partner. The opposite concern relates to men who fetishize trans women, otherwise known as chasers, or more recently, transamorous people. This latter term was seemingly coined by Jeffrey H. Nicholson, a pseudonym, in his 2020 paper in Transgender Studies Quarterly, on being a transamorous man. In my and many other people's opinions, this paper seeks to pathologize attraction to trans women and cis men, despite the fact that being a man who is attracted solely to women, no matter their assigned gender at birth, makes you straight. Parts of this paper are extremely self-congratulatory, with the author praising himself for being able to find a trans woman attractive in the first place. Other parts are just straight up fetishizing. One quote reads, "In the case of trans women, I find an aura of confidence in their femininity very appealing. I also recognize the important role I can play in reinforcing that sense of femininity. He goes on to state that he doesn't consider his preference for trans women, particularly with fully functioning penises, to be a fetish. But this same argument has been used by people who fetishize people of colour or disabled people. Transamory is essentially a way for straight cis men to avoid calling themselves straight, whilst it fetishizes and others trans women by separating them from other women. As much as trans people want acceptance, we want to be loved for the people that we are, not for the parts that we have, or the way our gender makes you feel. So there you have it. Catherine Full Body is a microcosm of trans feminine representation in media. It doesn't completely suck, but it's far from perfect. Whilst there are some touching moments between Ren and Vincent, and Erica is an example of a happy, healthy trans woman getting on with her life, the game continually exemplifies and perpetuates the damaging stereotypes about trans feminine people that directly contribute to transmisogynistic violence. Erica's story remains largely unchanged between Catherine and Full Body, potentially explaining the closer criticism of the transmisogynistic comments in the most recent installment. Atlus had the chance to improve upon their original writing, but chose not to. However, many trans women enjoyed her inclusion in both the original and the remake, so her inclusion in the first place should definitely not be disregarded. Rin's addition to the twisted tale of Vincent Brooks allowed the player a chance to question the original game's motives and binary view of freedom versus order. His interactions with Vincent are some of the least awkward in the entire plot, as Vincent feels more able to be himself around Rin and express his true feelings. I personally adore Rin's character, but his idolization of Vincent and his role as a catalyst for Vincent's growth are definitely a disappointment. So much more could have been done with his character regarding identity, in the sense of sexuality, gender, and a larger sense of self, given his amnesia storyline. Atlus could also have approached his character in a way that didn't add to the already pervasive idea of trans feminine people really being men in dresses who want to trick men into having sex with them. Writers, directors, and game devs out there, use Catherine Full Body as a form of what not to do when it comes to representing gender diversity and transfemininity, especially given the large number of trans women and trans feminine people in the games industry, whether that's as streamers, journalists, developers, or something else. Draw on Atlus's successes in this game and avoid making these mistakes. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you enjoyed it, please do give it a like and be sure to comment. As I mentioned briefly, there are several games by indie developers that feature trans feminine characters, so I'll leave a link to some of them in the description. If you have any that you would like to see us play, let us know in the comments below or on our social media pages. As always, a huge thank you to our patrons who make videos like this possible. We genuinely couldn't do this without you. Special thanks to our Ambassador tier patrons, Morgan, Paul, Maxime Ari, Beatrix Livesey Stevens, and Fizzlefur. If you aren't a patron already, please consider supporting us over at patreon.com/GameAssistYT. Catch us over on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for further discussions and conversations. And as always, thank you for watching, and take care.